right, so we're going to get started with exercise 215, and we're going to work with the same building that you designed last class. For those of you that weren't here last class, I know there's a handful of you, you'll be doing both. So you have to design the building, and then we'll deal with the environment. Essentially, today will be the first time that you're working within a context. In this case, it'll be the city of San Francisco. And the goal is to actually put a real sun in that's tied to a real time of day that will then render as if it is a real sun. We will also have a sky that should render kind of like a real sky. It's not quite a photorealistic sky, and I'll show you that. Next class, we'll get into photorealistic skies and how that part of it works. We will also go through texture mapping the building. And actually, I was rereading my handout here for 215. And step 2 in part 1 is something that I used to do to the glass on the outside of the building. I've replaced the materials. I have a different material that we're going to use, so you don't actually have to make the second skin, because this seems to work a little bit better in the renderings, and it takes a little less horsepower to do the renderings. So it seems like a happy medium. But I'll show you through that and walk through that, and you shouldn't have to worry about it. But I wanted to point out that I'm cutting that step out for today. So what I did to start is I went ahead and I opened up my building from last class. This was the one that I picked. You can pick any of the buildings. That's perfectly fine. And before I get really involved in this, I need to make it so that it's nice and clean, because I'm going to bring this in as a block into a final scene, which happens to be San Francisco, which we'll get to in a second. So now's the time to kind of clean up all the stuff. Now, because it's a block, I can obviously do an update to it. So if I didn't like the texture mapping or something didn't look right, I can go back and fix it and then update it in the main scene. But this process is kind of important. So first thing that I'll do is I'll look, and yeah, I had all my other buildings from yesterday here, or from Monday. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of those buildings. If you didn't want to lose your original buildings, you could also just do a save as, and we could save this as exercise 215 instead. There you go. Thank you so much. Okay. Let me save that. And then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this default layer. So I'll go ahead and delete the layer. If I can find delete layer. There we go. Yeah, go ahead and get rid of the objects on it. The floor, I have the skyscraper. I have a floor. I have a ceiling. I have a skin. I have a core. I also have layer 7. I don't need that anymore, so we'll get rid of that. And then I want to take this and place it over at the origin. And so if I move this object, say from here to 0, 0, 0, and then I'll Z for zoom, S for selected, so I can come back to it. And I've reoriented my building right at the origin. Remember, when it comes in as a block, it's much more convenient if it comes in at the origin. That's why I'm moving it there. And actually, I might add one more little line here so that I can move this over, because the corner of my building's missing. We'll move it over like that for as it comes. Oops, I moved only the skin, not the whole building. So let's try that one more time. Move. There we go. That'll just make it easier when I go to move it in terms of what that location is. So the next part of this is I want to go ahead and make sure that my materials are assigned and set up correctly for this particular skyscraper. So I'll start, and because I separated these out by layers, it makes it fairly easy to assign the materials. I'll go into my material library here, and for some reason these materials preload for me. Let me go ahead and purge all my materials because I don't need them. And then let me load a material for the floor, for the ceiling, and for the skin of the skyscraper. So these are all materials that should be available on the V-Ray materials that you downloaded from the course website. First off, under glass, there is a skyscraper glass that's both dark and light. If you want the building to appear more dark, pick the dark one. If you want it to appear more light, pick the light one. Okay, and I'll show you there's some quirks about this particular material, but this is designed for this purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the light one. And we'll load that. Then I'm going to go ahead and load a concrete for the floors. We'll just do a basic concrete. And then I'll go ahead and load I have to think of where. How about interior wall, textured sheetrock white? There we go. So I can use that for the ceilings. Okay. If you want to change the materials, you want to do wood floors or something, that's fine. I was just going for generic. I'm not really going to be doing a rendering from the inside. It's only from the outside, but such is life. So let me go ahead and load the concrete. I'm going to assign it to my floor layer. So I'll right-click on concrete and say Apply Material to Layer. And I'm then going to pick Floor. My textured sheetrock is going to be on the ceiling, so I'll right-click and say Apply Material to Layer, and it should be on the ceiling. My skyscraper glass is on the outside, so I'll right-click and say Apply Material to Layer, and this should be on the skin. Oh, and I didn't load something for the core. Let me load a different concrete for the core. Let me load material. And let's go back to concrete. And I'm going to use let's do a vertical plywood with form ties. And I will apply that. Apply material to layer, and I'll apply that to my core. So essentially, I've applied all the materials over here. Now it's a matter of looking at those materials and making sure they look right. So first off, let me switch into rendered view so that we can see a little bit of a preview. I'm going to turn off the skin altogether, and I'm going to look at the various pieces. So if, for example, I look at the concrete, looks like the texture map is really, really big. So it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to change the texture map. Let me go ahead and go into texture mapping. And it can be just a planar mapping from above. That's fine. We'll do a bounding box, world, UVW. There we go. If I look at that piece, it's a little bit better, but I want to change the scale. UVW repeat. Let's go x equals y equals z, and then UVW repeat of maybe like 50. So it just gets a lot smaller. Yeah, something like that is not bad, because obviously the scale of the building is a lot bigger. So I have that one set up correctly. I'm going to select all the rest of my floors. So let me select objects so that they're all selected, except for the one that I have correct. I'm going to go back to Properties. I'm going to click on Match Mapping to the one that I fixed. And we'll give it a little bit of time to go through and process here. But the idea is that the mapping should now match on all the floors, which is the goal. The white sheetrock I'm not overly worried about for the ceiling. The texture mapping is fine on that. I'm just going to kind of pass on that for right now. Let me turn off my floors and my ceilings to get back down to the core. I'm going to have to apply a mapping to this. So I'll go back to my properties. This is going to be a box map. We'll do a bounding box, world, capped, yes. And let's do the x equals y equals z. And let's change the repeat again. This might be even higher. Let's try 100 first. Let me take a look here. It might be less. Let's try 30. Yeah, that seems a little closer. If I was... That's 8 pieces across, so it's not too far off. It's probably a little bit more. It's probably like 35 or so. I'm just counting the number of panels, essentially, in the core to make it look about appropriate for what I'm trying to do. So now that I have that appropriate, again, it's tall, we'll move on to just the skin. So let me turn the skin back on, and I can turn off everything else but the skin, so that we're looking at it. And so right now, as I look at the skin, it really isn't looking at all like I want it to. And so this texture map needs to be applied. So let me go ahead and apply a box map to it. That'll help. So we'll do bounding box, world, and I want it to be capped, yes. Okay, so that's then been applied to it. And if we look at it, I have a piece of this that is displayed as reflective, and then there's a piece that's transparent. For whatever reason, when I do the actual rendering, however, this is opaque. And this is designed to be the 4-foot portion that is in between floors, and then we get to the reflective part. So there's a difference in the transparency. If I went to my materials and I looked at the glass skyscraper here, and I went into my transparency map, notice there's a capital M there, so it has a map applied, and I were to preview it, there's an opaque portion and a transparent portion. So those two are working well. There is also a little line that runs down one side that represents the little divisions between all the glass. So at first, this looks like, oh, it just looks like glass. But if we start to adjust this texture map, so let me select the object, and I want to view my mapping, or show mapping, and I get my little box here. We've all done this before. This is just review. Let me scale this box. So I'm going to scale 1D, and I'm going to scale across the front, and this is going to be the width of one pane of glass. So we'll say maybe 4 feet. Then I'm going to scale this direction, which should also be about the width of the glass. So we'll do that at 4 feet. Then I want to scale the height. So one more scale, 1D, for the height. And this is going to be the overall floor height. So in this case, it would be 16 feet. Then I need to move this so that it lands on the first real floor, or regular floor of the building. So let me go up to turn on my floors, and then let me move this object so that it lands right. Sorry, it's the ceiling. I need the top to land up right there, I think. Let me turn on the ceilings too. Sorry. No, this needs to go down. So I have to think through this. It needs to go down to there. And essentially what I've created is I've created these little window panes that represent all the pieces of the window. And then I have an opaque region that covers that lower floor section, the divisions between the two floors. And for whatever reason, it shows up as transparent instead of being solid. And I've never been able to figure out why. It's just the nature of the material. So once I have this set up, though, we can start to see all the divisions kind of represent the size and scale of the windows. So this is starting to get there as a building. So I'll go ahead and I'll save this at this point. I'll go to File and then Save. Actually, I should turn on these other layers. Let me turn on the core so that it's on. The skin is on. That's good. It looks like I have a duplicate up on the very top here. My material for the top of the building is glass. Doesn't really matter because I'm not looking down at my material, but I should probably explode the skin and change the material on the top to be something that looks more roof-like. But it doesn't really matter because we're going to render from Street View today anyway. So now that I have that set up, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Everything's on and ready to go. Let's make the skyscraper the default layer. And then I'll go to File and Save. And I'm going to be able to bring this into my scene. So the next piece of this is I want an actual context to be able to drop this building into. And I said we were going to put the building in San Francisco. So if you go to today's lecture here, or exercise, sorry. There's 215. At the bottom, you'll see a download for the San Francisco downtown.3dm. You're going to want to click on this link, which will take you to a Dropbox site where you can then choose to direct download that particular file. I've already downloaded it, so I don't have to wait. It's like a 60 megabyte file, 63. So it's a fairly decent size file, so it'll take a little bit of time for it to download. That's also why Dropbox is giving it to you instead of my website, so I don't have to pay to give it to you. So we'll let them do it. And then once you have that file downloaded, you're going to go ahead and open that file up. Like I said, I already have that open, or I already have that on in my downloads folder. Sorry. Let's see, downloads, there we go. San Francisco downtown, there we go. Let's open that up. This file is really big. It's not a file that I created myself. It's a file that was created by some grad students at Berkeley that's been around for a while. Unfortunately, it was built as a mesh, not a NURBS object, so it's triangulated, which makes it really heavy and difficult to work with. But like I said, it's something that somebody else made, and we're just borrowing it. I've looked for replacements, but I've never found a good quality replacement. So the other factor is this is a little bit old, so it's not, all the newer buildings aren't going to be there. But it's close enough for our purposes, and certainly will give us some background context. So give it just a second to open up. There we go. So it's opened up. If I zoom out, remember I told you this was going to be rather heavy. So moving in and out can be a little challenging. But there you are with San Francisco. Right, there's the Transamerica Pyramids there, for example. This long diagonal here is Market Street, just in terms of general context. This particular file does not include the Bay Bridge, so it's not there. But like I said, it's some context for our purposes. There's the waterfront right in there. I've picked a site that is identified in blue. I went ahead and put that in so that you guys wouldn't have to figure out where to put a building. So this fits nicely. It has the same footprint of the building you just designed. You can drop it right in. If you want to change your location, go for it. It's up to you. But in this, it's kind of preset it up for you to make it a little bit easier on you. So if I look at my layers on this, I have the San Francisco model that is purple, and I have the building site that is blue. Okay, so if I select the building site layer, let me select objects. There it is. I can zoom selected and zoom in just on this particular piece of the building here. So that little piece there represents the footprint of where you can place your building. So I tried to, it's not perfect, there's no curbs, there's none of that detail in this particular model, but I've tried to identify, okay, here's a spot that you could actually place a building. Okay, so there's your building envelope, and you're going to bring your building into this particular scene. So you guys have done this before. You'll go to File, and you'll go to Import, or excuse me, you'll go to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Reference. We don't want to import it. We want it as a block reference. That was my mistake. I apologize for that. I'll go and find my file. It was in today's folder. I just saved it. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say Open. I want to bring it in, and I want to prompt where it's going to go. I'm also going to change the rotation of the object, but I'll do that afterward because it's not going to line up perfectly with streets. I'll go ahead and say OK. I want to link this file, and I want the layer style to be reference. So we did this before. This is review. I'll go ahead and say OK, and that will let me bring this building in. I'm going to snap to this edge of my envelope, and then I will do a rotate. It's just a regular rotate, not a rotate 3D. And I'll line that up along the edge there of my building envelope. And now I've placed my particular building into its general context like that. Make sense so far? OK. So I have my building in. It's come in as a reference. There's all my materials. Those have all come in. Life is great. I do want to add some materials to this model. Right now, the purple doesn't have any materials applied to it. So you can choose when you're doing a rendering like this to try to do a photorealistic rendering where the background has all the building textures and whatever. But it's really hard to do well. You're almost better off taking a photo and collaging your building in Photoshop or something like that rather than trying to actually render what these buildings look like. So one of the things that I've found as a strategy that can really help is to make the background city, the massing is there, but you make it as if you were making a clay model. It's just white. And then you focus on your building. And so if you do a good job rendering your building, it's going to stand out against all these other forms, and it also draws attention to your building. So as a strategy for representing your ideas, it's a pretty good one. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to go into my materials, and you'll notice that the materials that I loaded previously from my block did come in here, which is good. I also think I already loaded for you the porcelain, the white porcelain, which is what I'm going to use. It's a little bit reflective, which I think looks good on this particular context. If it's not already loaded, you can right-click on See Materials, go to Load Material, and it'll be listed under porcelain, white porcelain. So I'm going to take the white porcelain and I'm going to apply it to my San Francisco City model layer. So I'll right click and say apply material to layer. And I'm going to put it on the San Francisco City, there you go, SF model layer. There we go. So if I were to switch this view into rendered mode, we would see that the background becomes white and my building has some material on it. Be careful when you switch it into rendered mode because it can be a little bit challenging on the computer's horsepower. Just be aware of that, depending on the complexity of the model. I'm going to go back to my shaded mode. Now, speaking of computer and horsepower and being able to render something like this, the more complex this building were to get, the harder it would be to manipulate. So if I started putting stuff inside my building, like tables and chairs and desks and whatever, which might be desirable, if I were to do that in my building, it would make this file heavier and heavier and harder to work with. And so we have a couple ways of dealing with that fact. Number one, if I just turn off the San Francisco model, suddenly everything goes really fast. That's good. So we can get away with that. The other thing that is built into V-Ray is something called a V-Ray proxy object. And I bring this up because I believe future versions of V-Ray are going to make this a really useful tool. Our version of V-Ray is a little bit behind. They've chosen not to update it yet. I'm hoping that they will soon. It makes this process a little chunky and it's a little hard to deal with, but the concept is still there. Essentially, what a V-Ray proxy object does is if you have something static in your scene that's not changing. So in the case of this model, it's the San Francisco City. It's not changing. It just exists. I don't need to, on an ongoing basis, see all of that. So if I make something called a V-Ray proxy object, it's kind of like doing InDesign where you reference a file. I can take an existing object in Rhino and make it a reference. That reference is only represented by a couple little triangles in the scene. So when I'm working and manipulating, it's barely even there. It doesn't tax the system much at all. But when V-Ray goes and renders, it says, well, let me go get all that geometry, bring it in, and I'll render with it. So it's only for rendering. The challenge with something like this is, one, making it work, and two, you can't go backwards. Once you take an object and make it a proxy object, you can't take the proxy object and make it back into a real object. So it's a one-way direction thing. So I'm going to show you, or attempt to show you, how to do it today. It may work for me. It may not work for me. It may work for you. It might not work for you. It's kind of hit or miss, but it's worth at least exploring as part of this particular concept. A couple other notes, though. If I were to suddenly make the city disappear or be represented by a few little triangles or something like that, I would lose the ability to set up my views in context. I'd be guessing. And I might set up a view, and it might be from inside another building when I go to render. So it's good to set up your views before you make the proxy object. So when you have the scene in place, you make your views. Lucky for you, I already have two views set up. If you go to Set View, you'll see that I have Perspective 1 and Perspective 2. Those are both street-level views that look down the street toward your building. It's two different angles. So if you go to Set View, Perspective 2, that'll show up at a slightly different angle. So I set those up in advance for you just in case you end up wanting to use them. So I'm going to go ahead and do a File Save As first. And we'll put this into my folder. And let's see here. We're in 215. There we go. And I'm going to do -1 just in case I don't like it. OK, perfect. So I have that set up. Let me just double check. Proxy object. OK. I'm going to hold off on doing the proxy object and actually creating it until the end just in case it crashes, so you don't have to watch me get this all back together. I'm going to leave it as it is and deal with the environmental stuff, and then I'll come back and make the proxy object and show you that part just in case it doesn't work out. So the next piece of this is I currently have no environment set up in this particular scene. So I'm going to create a layer for environment. And as a sub-layer of the environment layer, I'm going to create something called sun. So this is where we're actually going to put sun in. Thus far, we've always just set up a directional light with a little box, and you did the directional light or whatever. We'd like to be a little bit more accurate. And you've noticed in other modeling programs like SketchUp, you can put a sun in. So it would make sense that Rhino would allow you to put a sun in as well. It's a little bit different than SketchUp. When we do that, let me make the sun layer active here. There we go. I'm going to come up to my V-Ray toolbars, and there's a button for sun, and it has a little sun there. And when I click on that, I get something called the sun angle calculator. Now this is a throwback to when you have like an actual sun angle calculator diagram and you figure out what the sun angle is. Manual control, that's too much for me. Let's uncheck that and scroll down, and we can actually find San Francisco. So let me type in San Francisco. There it is. And I'll select it. Once it's selected in blue, that's now my location. You could also put in a latitude and longitude if you would rather. Okay, for our purposes, hey, this works out just fine. We'll pick San Francisco. It also changes our time zone so we can see what that is. If I scroll back up after I've selected San Francisco, I have a date and a time. And so here I can either type in a value. Right now it's set to today, 10/4 of 2017. And then I can pick my time. So we're at 3:40 in the morning. That's not going to have any sun up. So I'm going to slide this over. And you can see like a live preview here as I slide this over to, I don't know, about 9 o'clock or so. Furthermore, daylight savings time is currently on. So I'll check that box, and that adjusts the time accordingly because daylight savings time is on. I could specify the exact time or whatever. As I come up here under sun position, this is the actual position of the sun, you know, with your azimuth and your altitude, etc. So if you wanted to manually type that in, you could. Once all of this is done and I've set the time and the date that I want, I'm going to go ahead and say OK. But I'm not done. And a lot of times people just say OK and move on. It's not done because I actually have to put the sun in the scene. So if you look at your command line, it says, what position do you want your sun? Where do you want it to go? It doesn't matter where in the scene, but you have to have it in the scene. So I'll just put it at the corner here of my building so that it shows up. It looks almost the same as a directional light. The power of this light is a lot different, though. So I have that in. You can see the basic angle of that. Obviously, it's going to be casting some shadows kind of down and in this direction. If I didn't like it, I can go back and modify the sun. If I have it selected and I go to Properties, there will be a button under the Light Properties here for Modify Sun. I uncheck Manual Control, and I go back through this process again. So we'll go to San Francisco. Let me scroll back up. We're going to change, it is daylight savings time, but we're going to change it so that it's in the afternoon. There we go. I'll say OK. And now my sun changes its position. OK, so you can decide what position is appropriate for your particular model. Oops. There we go. I actually liked it better in the morning, so I'm going to modify it one more time. Or not. Apparently, I'm not going to modify the sun. It doesn't want me to. So we're going to leave it at 4 in the afternoon. If you wanted to set up a file where you were rendering at different times of day, under your environment, or excuse me, under your environment layer, you could have sun with different sun times, and then turn them on and turn them off. That's optional. Okay? For our purposes, we just need one sun, and I'm happy. So right now, if I were to render, that's great. I have a sun that's being applied to the building, but I don't have the other half of the equation, and that is the sky. So I need to set up the sky as well. So sun first, then sky. We're going to go to our V-Ray options. Click on the little O here. I'm going to go to environment. And previously, you guys have changed the reflection or refraction background to be white as a way of just making a uniform color. We don't want that anymore. We're actually going to apply a map to it. So I'll click on the M button for background here. And instead of picking an image, I'm going to look for something called a texsky. Just down here a little bit more. Texsky, there we go. And under my default sky options, I have an option to select the sun. I'm going to pick, why is it not? Gotta love it. It's not recognizing my sun. Let me put the sun in one more time. San Francisco. 9. Oh, that's fine. OK. There we go. Go back to my V-Ray options right here under my map. texsky. And it's still not showing up. How convenient, right? This is the first time this has ever happened to me. So there should be, and maybe for you guys there will be, a long string of numbers. That long string of numbers is your sun. I have no idea why it's not working for me right now. I'll leave it as Rhino document sun, and we'll see what happens. But it should be a long string of numbers. Under the GI skylight, you're going to do the same thing. I'll click on the M. I'll go to texsky. And again, it should be a long string of numbers. Don't know, maybe Rhino updated and I just haven't seen this before. We'll say OK. And so I have those two set up correctly. So now that I have my sun and I have my sky set, I'm going to go to one of my perspective views. Let me go to Set View. I'm going to go to Perspective 1, for example. So I'm looking at my building here. And I'll go ahead and save this before I move on, just in case. And the next piece is to actually do a rendering. Okay, and I'll come back and do the proxy object just in case it crashes. But for right now, I'm going to do a rendering in front of you guys here. A couple things. Under the V-Ray options, if we look at my output, if I currently see here or get my view aspect, what I render is going to be exactly what I see, which isn't too much of my skyscraper. So this is one time where we want to override the viewport with a height that's higher than a width. So let me set my height or my width at maybe 100. I'm doing a test rendering right now. And let me do my height at maybe 1,000. Okay, so narrow and tall is going to give me a rendering that includes the top part of the building, even though I can't see it. So I have that set. The one other thing that may be relevant is as we increase the complexity of these renderings, turning on distributed rendering can be a big advantage. And so in the computer lab here, but also in the labs across the way, or at least on the ET network, we have the ability to use computer horsepower that isn't being used. So somebody's sitting there logged in, and they're typing a Word document for their English thing. They're not using much of their computer's processing power. So you, as somebody rendering, can steal a little bit of that processing power and make your rendering go faster, which is great. Okay? In order for it to work, there should be this little thing that's running down at the bottom of your computer. It's called the XML DRS spawner. And if you see it pop up when you log in, it should automatically pop up to every computer that you log in. Don't ever close it out of courtesy, especially if you're working on an English paper, because you can, it kind of pays itself back when you need it. Okay? So it's currently running, which is great. If I go into my V-Ray options and I come up here under System, there's a box for distributed rendering. Currently, it is not on. I'm going to check the box for being on. And then under Hosts, I need to click this little 3-dot button and go find some hosts. So let me find some servers. "19 were unused, so there's 19 computers somewhere that weren't already being used. I can see those 19 here as a list. They're shown by IP name, not ET103-1. Sometimes there'll be a bad one in the bunch. Something's wrong with one of the computers, and you have to figure out which one it is. We'll go through that when we get a little bit later on in the semester. I'll turn the first 5 or so on. It doesn't mean I'll get all 5, especially if more people are using the spawner, because you might jump in front of somebody else or whatever. What happens in the way that this works is every computer has a set number of threads or a set number of simultaneous processes that it can happen during rendering. These computers can run at 8 threads, I think. I think they're 8-thread computers. I think the ones in 124 can run at 12 or 16, depending. So when you ask, I want somebody to help me render, this computer is going to help me render, we send out one frame or one thread, and the computer says, yeah, I'll give you a thread, and I'll render that one thread. As soon as that one little thread is done, it goes back into the pool, and you go out and try to get more. And so the computer's constantly doing that during this process. So anyway, it's set up. I've turned it on. I've picked those first couple. You can pick more, but I wouldn't pick more than about 5 at a time, because V-Ray likes to crash when you pick them. So 5 is about good. You can come back, and so, for example, I could pick another 5 or so. And then I could say OK, and I can load up on the number that are actually working. So now that all of that's done, it's time for me to go ahead and start rendering. It's also useful when you do a rendering to render small first and big later. So do a small test version, does it look the way I want it to, and then do a final version a little bit later. So I'll go ahead and start the rendering process. And I'll get my little pop-ups here in just a second. There you go. So first off, you can see that my rendering is much taller than it used to be. The other thing that I realized is I forgot one step. It's on the handout. You would think I could do it, right? The last part in part 4, because we now have a sun in the scene, everything is really bright, because that's what a sun is. It's really bright. So we now have to turn on something called a physical camera, which is essentially like taking a picture of the scene. So if I go down here to camera, I need to turn on physical camera. And if you have any familiarity with cameras, or you took 135, all this stuff should make sense. We have a shutter speed, we have an f number or an aperture, we have a film speed, we have there's shutter speed, etc. So all of these settings, you can change what's happening in the particular camera. Generally, the only one we really need to change is the shutter speed. So I'm going to change the shutter speed. Well, we'll leave it at 300. That's probably a pretty good place to start. But this is also why you render small first. So that one's done. Looks like my rendering was a little bit too big. So let me go back to my output. And instead of 1,000, we'll do it maybe 600. And then I'll go ahead and render again. So it is important to point out that when you do these renders, it can take, especially if you're using distributed rendering, it can take a little bit of time for the render engine to go out and find where the other hosts are on the network. So it can take a little bit to get started. OK, so I did a smaller rendering. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can get a sense for there's my building, there's the reflections. But notice also that there's a sky that goes from a lighter blue all the way up to a darker blue. That's what it should look like, because that's what a sky looks like. So we're starting to make this look a little bit more like a real rendering. So now that I've done this and I'm kind of happy, maybe I need to make a few tweaks. Maybe the environment is a little bit dark. If that's the case, I could go back to my I could go back to my V-Ray options. I could go back to my physical camera. Here we go. And I could make this, if I want it, if it's a little dark, I would lower this number. So maybe we'll go to 200. I'll close that. I'm also going to go back to my options here, and I'm going to change my size here. I'm going to lock the proportion. Well, let me do it maybe 100 by 400. Let me lock the proportions, and then I'll render this a little bit wider. We'll do 400 by 1600. I'll go ahead and close that, and we'll start up the render engine again. So each of these little squares during the rendering, I told you we had 8. Those are 8. Those are all my computer. They say 0, 1 on them. It takes a while to get the content out to another computer to have that come in. If I end up getting the content out before the rendering finishes, you'll see this populate with lots more little squares. And if I were to zoom in as it was rendering, it would actually tell us what the computer number was that was rendering. Yes, you're going to be, but you're not quite ready to do it yet, because we're going to do a little bit more with the environment. You'll have clouds and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and let this one render out as the example of what we're going on. You're going to be doing something very similar to this. It'll probably take you a few renderings to get the settings correct, and that's to be expected. You should be turning in one rendering today as part of your work, and you should be getting reflections off the building, right? That's definitely part of this. and it obviously should have a sky and that part of it. If you again feel like it's still a little bit dark, you can change that exposure in the physical camera settings. Okay, so I'll close that for right now. The other part of this that I was talking about is that V-Ray proxy object, and I told you I'd come back to it at the end just in case it didn't work. So in the case of the V-Ray proxy object, let me come back. I'm going to save this just in case. All right. I'm going to select all of the San Francisco City model. So I'll do that from the layers rather than trying to select it. So let me go in here and say select objects. I now have all the San Francisco City model there. And there's a little tree-looking icon in your V-Ray toolbar. That's the V-Ray proxy objects. There's two different clicks. The standard click, your normal click, will import a proxy object. Right-clicking on this button will create the proxy object. So we want to right-click on the button to create the proxy object. So I'll right-click on it. And it's going to say, where do you want to save this VR mesh file? So it needs to go in my flash drive, into today's folder. Let's see here, 136. Today was 215. And we'll call this San Francisco mesh. And I'll go ahead and click Save. Then I get this little drop-up, or this pop-up window here that says export all selected objects to a single mesh file. I do want that. Automatically create the proxies. Warn me if I'm going to override an existing file. It's going to simplify all of that San Francisco down to 100 triangles. I could make it a little bit more accurate and say I wanted it to be 1,000 triangles or something, but that obviously increases the processing power necessary. I could go all the way down to 1 triangle if I wanted to, or 10 triangles. But at some point, you have no even sense that the object's there. So I'm going to leave it at the default, which is 100, and then I'll go ahead and say OK. Now, when I say OK, this is where you run the risk of things crashing. It might work. It might not work. I've had luck where it works. I've had luck where it hasn't worked when I've done this in lecture. So fingers crossed, we'll see what happens. And that's why I did it at the end, just in case. So I'll go ahead and say OK. This process also takes a while. So it might be 5 or 10 minutes before it finishes writing the proxy. It's a really hard thing for it to do for whatever reason. So I will leave this open. I'll pause the recording. If it works, I'll come back and show you what it looks like at the end. I'm hoping that it'll work so at least you can see this as a concept. OK? OK, so I got lucky, and it did work for me. So if right now I were to move around, it's obviously significantly easier for me to move around because of all that data being gone. The city still exists, and when I go to render it, it will still look like the city is there. But as I'm working on it and manipulating it, it's basically taken most of the city and represented by those triangles. Unfortunately, like I said, it's really hard to judge where anything is or where the streets are or whatever, which is why you want to set the views up ahead of time. Otherwise, it's a lot of trial and error in the renderings. So in our case, I already have those set up, so I can still go back to set view, perspective 1. There's my perspective 1 view. And regardless of what I'm seeing, it's still going to render out the way it should. Likewise, I could go to perspective 2. So let me set view. Let me go to perspective 2. And there it is set up in this particular view. So at this point, I can go back and I can render. And all of these buildings are going to show up as if they are still there. So it's just a way of simplifying working with it. I'll go ahead and do that render so you guys can see it in its final version. I need to adjust the proportions for this one a little bit. It needs to be a little taller. So let me go back into my output here. It might still work. We'll give it a shot and see. And then I'll go ahead and I'll render it. And we'll see what happens. I'll let this go a little bit, and then you guys will be able to see when it's done that the whole city is still there, even though it's not there in the proxy object. So hopefully that'll help you guys see what the proxy object does. But it did take 5-7 minutes or so to create that object in the first place. So it's a little bit intensive in that process.